The gatehouse keeper woke to fists on oak and a voice he knew too well. The emperor stood in the courtyard with a cloak thrown over a bare tunic, hair loose, dust on his sandals. Behind him jittered 3 freedmen and a scribe clutching a bundle of papers no one would ever read. The sky held the thin light before dawn. Somewhere in the city, horns still echoed from the Praetorian camp, and the last of the palace guard had melted away like fog. Word had run through Rome after midnight. The Senate had met. The emperor had been declared a public enemy, and whoever brought his head would be paid for it. The man who once made whole provinces move at a gesture now begged for a horse. He had tried the barracks first. The Praetorians answered with silence and locked doors. He sent for a famed gladiator, the one he had cheered from a gilded box, hoping for a blade and a quick hand. The messenger returned alone. He hurried to the house of a loyal officer and found a threshold swept clean of footprints. In the dark, a few servants bolted when they saw him. One old woman crossed herself and slid sideways along a wall to keep from catching his eye. Pride kept his voice steady, but the lines in his face had deepened into something even he could not perform away. They slipped out by a back gate with their hoods up, moved through gardens that still smelled of roses, and took a narrow road toward the Salarian Way. The 4 of them passed people who did not raise their heads. A mule brayed from a stable. Somewhere a rooster tried a half-hearted crow and quit. The man leading them, Phaon, a minor official who had never expected to host a fallen emperor, talked fast about a small villa beyond the markers, hidden in scrub. The others nodded at everything. At a crossing, they heard hooves and froze. A patrol clattered past without looking into their faces. When the sound faded, they ran. The villa sat low against a bank of sand and grass. Phaon opened the door and pointed to a storeroom, and then a trench behind it that might serve as a hiding place. The emperor, who had once commanded architects to raise a palace that swallowed a hillside, stared at the hole and knew what it meant. Someone found a tattered cloak. Someone else pulled a hood over his head and smeared his cheeks with mud. They called him by a different name, as if the gods could be tricked by such small theater. He asked for water. He drank with both hands and set the cup down, like a man who had forgotten how to set a cup down. Inside, they closed the shutters and brought in a small lamp. The freedman waited for orders and prayed he would not give any. He tried to compose a letter and stopped. He catalogued slights like a bookkeeper, officers who had insulted him, senators who had smiled and then plotted, officers who turned their cloaks when the wind shifted. The scribe offered him a page to sign. His hand hung over it and did not move. The cloak slipped from his shoulders. He pulled it back on with a shiver that came from some place no cloak could reach. He spoke of the fire years back, and the night the city burned a ring around his palace. He said he had been blamed for that too, by men who needed a story that fit the heat. After the ashes cooled, he had found a scapegoat. He gave orders that Christians be seized, nailed up, wrapped in hides and set upon by dogs, or tied to poles and set alight after sunset so the gardens could glow. He spoke of it like a man reading a list of punishments that belonged to someone else. None of the men in the room met his eye. Even the lamp seemed to pull away from him. They begged him to flee east, to catch a ship, and let time soften the Senate's rage. He said his voice would still carry on the other shore. He asked for his jewels, for a chest of coin, for the actors he loved. There were no jewels and no chest. The actors had already found new patrons. He paced in a short line across the room, stopped, and pressed his forehead to a post. "What an artist is dying," he said at last, half to himself. Then another confession, smaller and truer. He hated the thought of an executioner's hand on him. Outside, the road kept its rhythm. A pair of horsemen slowed near the gate and then rode on. He flinched hard at the sound and forced a laugh that fooled no one. Phaon took a spade and scraped at the earth behind the storeroom, carving the outline of a shallow grave. The freedmen wept while they dug, not in grief, but with the exhaustion of people who know the end of labor is still more labor. The emperor watched. He had ordered men executed before, but he had never watched a grave open for someone with his own name. When the trench was ready, he looked at the dagger on the table and looked away. He asked for someone to show him how. No one moved. He sat on a low stool and held the blade and found his hands would not move either. He asked for help holding the point steady. The most loyal freedman, Epaphroditus, the secretary who had written too many orders to count, knelt and placed the hilt against his master's ribs, angled toward the place a man's breath sits. They waited. The emperor closed his eyes. Then a shout came from the road. Riders, orders, the sound of a gate pulled on its hinges. He jerked forward, panic rising, and the point slipped. He cried out, not in pain, but in fear, and then fear became pain as the blade went in. The freedman pushed to make it sure. The emperor choked and tried to swallow the sound and could not. He thought of a stage he had loved, of crowds, of a mother he had ordered murdered, of a wife whose name he had spoken only in anger, of the senators who gathered while he bled. He tried to keep the world large, and it shrank to a spot of lamplight that trembled no matter how still the hands around it tried to be. The door broke, and a centurion stepped into the room, sword half drawn, breath high in his chest. He saw the dagger, the blood, the faces, and his training took over. He reached to stop the wound with his hand, the way a farmer might tamp soil around a sapling. The emperor saw the metal, saw the uniform, and summoned something from deep inside the shame that had been eating him since midnight. "Too late," he said, and added, with the pride of a man who can't help it, "This is loyalty." The centurion held the hand where it was anyway. The last sound was a rattle swallowed under a final breath. When it was over, the men in the room stared at the floor because the floor was simple. Outside, the riders waited for the word they had not fully believed would come. The Senate rescinded its punishment against his body because the problem had solved itself. Orders were written for a funeral that would be quiet enough to keep the city from splitting yet again. 2 women who had once cared for him when he was small, and a mistress who remembered him before he learned to be a tyrant, took charge. They washed the body and wrapped it, kept his face covered, and saw to the pyre. Ashes went into a marble urn. They found a space among the tombs his family had bought when fortune looked like it would last. Rome did what Rome always does. It argued while it worked. The army chose, then chose again, and the empire shifted hands with the violence of a crowd pressed too tight at a doorway. In the tenements, people told stories about the day the emperor ran through gardens like a thief. In the forums, men who had once applauded his speeches swapped insults they had kept in their mouths while he had breath. Poorer citizens, who had once accepted his gifts of grain and games, counted loaves and shrugged. Power had changed address. The price of oil and bread had not. The Christians did not forget. Some had died in torches that flamed at dusk. Others had been sewn into the arena floor for animals to find. They met at night and repeated a name and a prayer and tried not to speak the emperor's name at all. They told their children that a man who believed himself a god had died like any other man, frightened and alone, asking for a help no one could give him. They added that kings and mobs and fires come and go, but mercy reaches further than fires do. It was not vengeance, it was remembering. His palace, with its halls painted to look like the sky, began to lose that mirror brightness. Pillars collected dust. Servants learned new names and then learned still newer ones. A garden where people had once walked by torchlight went back to the ordinary green of vines and trees. The lake he had dug to float his pleasure boats was drained and paved, stone replacing water in the way power likes. Flat, solid, permanent until the next earthquake of men arrives. The histories set down by the old secretaries and the later governors are not kind to him. They list his cruelties next to his compulsions, his vanity next to his moments of real courage, and they leave it to us to decide whether he was a monster who liked music or a performer who learned to kill to keep the performance going. What is certain is smaller and sharper. Once, after midnight, he ran from his own city, and papers rustled uselessly in a scribe's hands. Once, with soldiers at the gate and a shallow ditch in the yard, he could not bear the thought of being led by the neck, and did the one brave thing he had left. By late afternoon the road had quieted again. Wind moved through reeds by the wall. The freedmen had gone, each to his own calculation of safety. Only the smell of smoke lingered. A child passing the villa weeks later would lift dust from the floor and draw a figure that looked like a man with his arms out, then wipe it away because the game had stopped being fun. Empires live in marble. Endings happen in rooms where dirt floors lift and resettle when no one is walking. The emperor who fed Christians to dogs and called it justice died at his own hand, in fear of rope and sword, with no crowd to sing him out. There was no triumphal procession, only a cart at dusk. The last order he gave was to himself. Thank you for listening to Divine Crime. Subscribe for more true stories from the most dangerous book ever written.